How's it going? Adam Drake here, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about the carburetor repair kits. I did a video, I don't know, a little while back that talked about the two different versions. So we've always had a carburetor repair kit that came with all the O-rings, carb boot, all the things you need to rebuild your carburetor. And now we have a carb kit that comes with all those same O-rings and boot, but also has the tools. So I'm going to just kind of walk you through, show a closer look of how I go through and rebuild a carburetor with using the tools from OS. Now, a couple things to kind of think of or remember before you rebuild your carburetor. It's always nice to measure the low speed needle, the mid speed, and the high speed. So when you take everything apart, you can kind of set it back close to the same settings before you replaced all the O-rings. We also have on our website our recommended carb settings for pretty much any of the OS-based engines. So if you ever get lost, you can go to drakeracing.com and look up those carb settings. Also, I had a question recently that was asking, do the needles in the carburetor wear out? Not really. So it is possible over an extreme amount of time if you have a super old engine where there can be a little bit of wear, but for the most part, you're not going to wear out any of the needles or any of the metal parts with an OS carburetor. So what we have here is a 21J. Sometimes this brass high-speed assembly will kind of get worn a little bit from like your body rubbing on it, or it can get damaged if you have a bad crash. So that part sometimes can be changed or replaced. But other than that, what you're mainly looking for is you're inspecting, making sure that the carb boot is in good shape, that each of the O-rings have nice tension on them so that the O-rings are not loose, causing the needles to move during a run. So again, we'll take a closer look. I will go ahead and show you kind of how I measure the needles, record that information before taking the needles fully out, and how I replace the O-rings, and also what comes in the kit as far as the O-rings and little gaskets and things like that. So we'll take a closer look. Okay, so as you see here, these are the different carb repair kits. These are the part numbers, and again, both are available on the drakeracing.com. As far as what you get in terms of O-rings and little gaskets, you basically have everything needed if you wanted to kind of fully rebuild the carburetor as far as these O-rings go, and they also come with a carburetor boot. Now, this kind of large washer, this is to be used if you have an older 21J carburetor that has the yellow insulator. So what this does is it drops down into the engine case, and it basically shims up the carburetor and insulates the base of the carburetor. If you have a 21J that has the black insulator, you do not need this spacer. You get the washers that go between the fuel inlet nipple and this brass assembly. So we'll go ahead and we'll replace those first. Just make sure when you take this fuel inlet nipple off, it is different from top to bottom. The top side, there's more of a flat area where this brass assembly is going to touch. So you can just use your fingernail, or you could use an X-Acto knife to get rid of the older washer here. And then there's also one that will be on the carburetor. So you'll slide that onto the high-speed needle assembly, the fuel inlet, another one of those washers, and then line that up, screw it into the carburetor. And now this can be, I get this question a lot of times when people get a new engine. sometimes they're scared, not knowing if this can be loosened up and rotated to adjust the position of the fuel inlet nipple. So traditionally it'll come facing towards kind of the back of the car, towards the cooling head. On all my Mugen stuff, I run it more towards the front because I run the shortest fuel line from the tank to the carb as possible. So you can use any 8mm wrench and just snug this down. Again, with this piece being brass, you don't need to put a ton of pressure, but it does need to be snug because if this comes loose, it can cause a lot of problems. So as far as checking the needles, you want to make sure you zero out your calipers. We'll start with a low speed needle. You don't want this end to go into the slot for the low speed needle. You'll want it to rest across the top, and then you'll want to make sure that that sits flat. And as you can see, I have a measurement of 0.63. So we are 0.63 in from flush. I already recorded that in my notes over here. We'll now check the mid-speed needle. We're at 0.5mm from flush. And then also the high-speed needle, which we're at 1.46mm in from flush. Again, this is just to give us a reference. When we take all the needles out, we want to make sure that we put them back close so that we don't have as much tuning to do. Now, for the idle gap with any OS engine, you'll always want to set the idle gap at 0.5 millimeter. What I like to do is I'll just take a zip tie. You need to measure the tip of the zip tie. So this is a 0.57 thickness at the tip. So what I will do is drop this zip tie in, and you need just the tip of it to go into the carburetor. And as you can see, it's actually pinching the zip tie. It's holding the zip tie in place. So that means my idle gap is currently smaller than this 0.56 thickness of the zip tie. Now, if I turn the idle adjustment in, eventually it will get to a point where you can see it getting looser, it's starting to fall, and then eventually the zip tie completely falls out. So now my idle gap is at 0.6 is what we're going to say. So if this was 0.56 and we pushed it in until that zip tie fell out, now the idle gap is slightly more than what we would normally want. So it's giving us a pretty good reference. If we're at 0.6, we would just back the carburetor off about 1/4 to 1/2 a turn, make sure everything is free, and then again, just to check it, I'll put just the tip of the zip tie right in the center, and then this zip tie will just barely slide in and out. So again, we're just over 0.5 millimeter, so I'll just take that back a couple hours, and that'll be a good reference point. Now, it's fine if the idle gap ends up being slightly below that 0.5 millimeter or slightly above, depending on the condition of your engine. But 0.5 millimeter is just a really good reference for any of the OS-based carburetors. Okay, so we're going to start with the idle, with replacing that O-ring. So we'll take the idle screw out, just wipe it off with a clean microfiber towel. With the O-rings, you can always use a little bit of Afrin oil. Use that as an assembly lube. As far as removing the old O-ring, I just use an X-Acto knife. I'm not really concerned if I cut or damage the O-ring. The X-Acto knife is just kind of the easiest thing to get in there and remove the O-ring. Then we will take the mid-size tool, and the idle screw will drop all the way down into that. Make sure you use the same size O-ring, so it's the middle of the 3 different sizes, and it just slides all the way up the tool and then drops down into the idle screw. So then we're going to take and screw the idle screw back in. Now we're going to have to reset the idle gap like we just did. So I'm going to back this out just a little bit. Make sure everything moves free. And then I'm going to take the tip of this zip tie and then flip that upside down. And I will again just turn in this real slow till the zip tie falls out. Once the zip tie falls out, I'll just back that off 2 to 3 hours, check and look, and that way I know I'm really close to that 0.5 millimeter of idle gap. Now we'll go ahead and do the mid speed. So on the mid speed, you actually have 2 O-rings. You have the largest O-ring, which is the same that's used for the high speed, and also a really, really small O-ring. So again, take a clean microfiber towel, just make sure, kind of wipe anything off. Use my X-Acto knife to get behind the O-ring. And again, if you tear or cut the O-ring, it's fine because you're replacing them for a reason. So once you get it kind of caught behind there, you can kind of just twist it off. And then we'll do the same thing with the really small O-ring. So the small one I had to just basically cut off. Again, wipe everything down. As you're wiping it down, you're also just inspecting to make sure that there's no damage or nothing looks out of place. So I'll first put the larger O-ring on. Again, just slides up the tool, snaps right into place. Now we take the small tool and the smallest O-ring, slides up, snaps into place, and then we'll reinstall the mid speed. And then once we put that back in, I always just kind of feel it with my finger. You want to start with it basically at flush. And again, we're only trying to get it back to the settings we took it apart from just as a baseline. Once the carburetor's installed back on the engine, you are going to have to make some small adjustments. Now we'll do the low speed. So the low speed is the longest needle, but just has 1 O-ring. So it's going to be the middle-sized O-ring. Just repeating the same process, taking your X-Acto knife, cutting that old O-ring off, inspecting the needle, and then again, we will use the mid-size tool with the mid-size O-ring, and you will just slide that up into place. So this setting was at 0.64 originally. I'm at 0.66, so we'll back that off an hour. .61, so that's close enough. Now we'll do the high-speed assembly. So sometimes with a high-speed assembly, there can be a little bit of like dust or dirt. So when I'm going to pull this needle out, I always like to kind of angle it to where if there is any dust or any buildup, because that's the most exposed needle and O-ring on the car, I kind of tilt it to where it's at an angle, almost upside down, so any of that dust can kind of fall out and not fall into the carburetor. So we'll take the big tool again. And then I'm also going to just kind of wipe off. Again, just to make sure no dust goes back down into this high-speed assembly. Sometimes with a high-speed needle, you'll almost have to kind of go backwards just a little bit till you kind of feel the threads lock into place. And then as you're threading it in, just apply a little bit of pressure so that those threads catch. Our high-speed setting was at 1.45. So you gotta go just a little bit more. We're going to start with the high speed just a little bit on the rich side and then work our way back in. So we're at 1.45, now we're at 1.4. And then there is also a new O-ring, which we had already pulled off for around the base of the carburetor. Reinstall the Venturi. And now the carburetor is ready to go back on the engine. And again, you are going to have to make some small adjustments, but just wanted to show kind of how to fully rebuild the carburetor and how to use the tools from OS for installing the new O-rings for any of your OS-based engine.